Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society. My name is Stephen Harper. I'm the Senior Director for Policy here at the Society, and we're delighted to see all of you here. The great thing about an end of program season event is we tend to find ourselves with our greatest friends, and I know there's a number in the audience. And we're very grateful over the course of this fall to have had you here to discuss a wide range of issues affecting Korean politics and policy. And today we close with one of my favorite individuals in the world and great colleagues in the field, Dr. John Park, who is the director of the Korea Project at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Belfer Center. But John has really a very rich background, as many of you here are familiar with. He has spent time not only at Harvard, but also at MIT, and has had stints in the private sector with Goldman Sachs, Boston Consulting Group, and has traveled quite extensively. John is very well published, and we're always thrilled when he has the time to join us here at the Society. So welcome back to our stage atop 350 Madison, and thanks to all of you who are streaming live and listening via podcast. John, we'll go straight into the issues because it really has been a rather wild ride in recent months. We have the United States and North Korea at something of a standoff with a North Korean deadline fast approaching. We have had a very difficult year and a half in Korea-Japan relations, and perhaps some slight progress forward in recent weeks. We have China and North Korea having seemingly re-bridged their relationship. So lots of regional dynamics, and most of us now are looking into the new year with some great concern about the potential for an uptick in tensions again on the Korean Peninsula. So if I could begin maybe first with the Japan-Korea issue. We've just had a meeting in Madrid where the two foreign ministers, Motegi and Kang, have had a chance to have some exchange. Do you feel that we're off on a slightly more positive footing, or how are you viewing the Korea-Japan relationship right now?
Sure, Steve. Thank you, and thanks to Tom and the Korea Society team, Jonathan, for having me here today. It's always great to be back. The part about the South Korea-Japan relations crisis right now is that we're seeing a little more breathing room. So December 16th is when the two negotiating teams will be meeting together. But in many respects, it's a pushing back of the deadline. The issues still remain on the table. In many respects, I think there's triage going on. But a lot of it is tied in with GSOMIA, the Military Intelligence Sharing Agreement. Recently, we saw the Secretary of Defense on the U.S. side, Esper, going to South Korea and trying to be a bridge of sorts between South Korea and Japan. But ultimately, I think the two main things to keep focus on, one is that once the GSOMIA issue came into the picture, that really became an issue with the United States, not necessarily with Japan. And so that type of pressure and reaction coming from Washington is something that I'm uncertain if those in Seoul calculated that portion of it, but that pressure came on very hard and very quickly. So the fact that you have pushing back of the deadline, suspension of the deadline for the time being creates some space. But in terms of what they could hammer out, because it's taking place in the public eye, it's going to be, I think, very difficult to try to come to some kind of arrangement. If you can keep pushing back these deadlines, that in of itself, I think, provides something of a coping mechanism. The second point to keep in mind with the South Korea-Japan dynamics right now is that we are in the era of economic statecraft. Not only do we have the South Korea-Japan dynamic happening on the trade side of things, we also have U.S.-China trade. And if there is one country in the international system that is directly affected by these issues, it is South Korea. And so that element of it, you're looking at a domestic situation in South Korea, already a lot of issues, a lot of hurdles. But the fact that the economic statecraft is playing out in such a direct fashion, I think is another aspect that we have to monitor very closely, because it can have that very direct domestic effect because it affects the economy.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the viability is for Seoul relative to having seemed to have borne more of a brunt of the economic costs than Japan, and the political variable ahead of the April elections in terms of the amount of flexibility that the Blue House has to make forward progress with Tokyo?
To unravel that, you're looking at point of view coming up from the Japanese side that this does not have anything to do with the wartime labor issue, that this is about South Korea and the perceived inability to control the exports, exports that can go, exports that can go into WMD proliferation. So I think from that dynamic, you see a very large type of framing of the issue, making the narrowing of it that much more difficult. But usually in the past, we've had these type of agreements, understanding happening discreetly. But the fact that it's being reported almost in real time, I think, again, makes it very difficult for the two governments to figure out a way forward that could be face-saving for both sides. And with the stakes getting even higher with the April elections coming up next year, there's always a part of complicating the situation and the type of focus that Seoul wanted to have, the type of message you wanted to craft. I think there will be elements that won't necessarily be in the Seoul government's control. So this is the element of already a domestic and foreign situation for South Korea becoming more difficult. And you kind of see an alignment of stars that you worry if this is the calm before the storm for many countries, but particularly for South Korea.
Yeah. You mentioned the surprise South Korean strategists may have had at the U.S. reaction on military intelligence sharing pact between Korea and Japan. There may have been, the suggestion has been that there may have been an implicit connection with the current impasse over the status of forces agreement, the special measures agreement between the United States and the ROK. Do you think that perhaps acknowledgement then of the need to get trilateral relations back on, the U.S. priority, has led South Korea to hope that there may be some more flexibility in the talks? And where are we by way of the SMA and the discord between South Korea and the United States over here?
Sure. And, tying into the theme of these type of stars aligning and having this detrimental effect on South Korea pretty much simultaneously, the burden sharing negotiations, there's a new dynamic, and it's that 5X. So per year, the U.S. demand now is $5 billion contribution from the South Korean side. This is another issue that previously was done discreetly between the two sides. But now that it's being played out in public, again, it makes it very difficult for negotiators on both sides to come to this common ground, to this compromise situation. But I think the biggest danger here is that it brings into question what is the purpose of the alliance when you're looking at this type of sharp increase in a very short period of time. The element that adds another layer of complexity is that it's also happening in the U.S.-Japan dynamic. And so now we have a comparative lens. It's not just a function of what South Korea is willing to bargain and negotiate, but benchmark to what the Japanese side will do as well. It's a separate negotiation, but 5X on the U.S.-Japan side of things, as much as that is something the Japanese government has to deal with, could potentially be an opportunity as well in terms of some longer defense planning on the Japanese side. So this benchmarking that goes on could make it even more difficult for the Seoul government in terms of what it is willing to finally agree to with the U.S. side. But the burden sharing negotiation component of it, the structural element that is big difference now is that before it was a 5-year interval. And the fact that we've defaulted now to a 12-month, and then within that less than a year to get these negotiations concluded, adds a type of pressure and the removal of wiggle room that we're basically on uncharted territory in terms of what we've grown to become familiar with these 5-year increment burden sharing negotiations.
Yeah, sure. There have been calls for greater transparency in the process. In fact, the Korea Society president, Tom Byrne, had a piece out in the New York Times saying that we do need greater transparency in this process, and it can't be reduced to simply balance sheets without a better explanation. Do you have any insight in terms of how the U.S. has arrived at this and where we may see the talks progress, or if there's some potential for some off-ramps or some openings?
Sure. The most visible face to the 5 times formula was John Bolton when he was National Security Advisor. In his last overseas trip to Asia, when he went to both Tokyo and Seoul, that was the message that the Trump administration was looking at 5 times increase in contributions both by Japan and South Korea. So there was some speculation that when you saw John Bolton removed from the National Security Advisor position, that this was somehow tied directly to him. But it looks like it's a part of a broader initiative and something that was reiterated at the NATO meeting where President Trump talked about how specifically South Korea should pay more. And that's the element that I think when we tie it into with electoral politics in the United States as well, it's a great talking point. And I think that confluence of factors means that it's not going to go away, that it's going to be very public, it's going to be very high profile. You're going to have public reaction in the United States as more facts in incremental fashion are released. And so even in earlier iterations, this is not new, when there was discussion about what is fair, a period when Senator John McCain was on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the congressional reaction when the details came out was why South Korea isn't paying more. But when those reports, were released on the South Korean side, covered by the journalists on the South Korean side, the South Korean public reaction, National Assembly reaction is the whole idea of paying too much. And so that dynamic has already been there, but amplified, I think, is the notion that you would close this gap in a short period of time rather than something that is a part of a longer game plan where you do bring transparency to the process. Both sides are aware of what the expectations are. The fact that it's coming out piecemeal, I think, makes it more difficult to craft a common narrative. And then within the overall idea that somehow the US is being ripped off, or South Korea is essentially paying for forces that are there for the protection, but not in an alliance situation, but almost in a transactional matter. Mm-hmm. That's an element of public diplomacy. I think there's a priority in trying to get some crafted message that is common to both sides out there.
Yeah, and that unwieldy nature, since you've invoked the meeting of NATO this week, one, the term you've just employed, protection, that was used by the president, struck some as an unusual term of reference. The other was having made the comments about Rocket Man again and North Korea perhaps leaning towards some sort of rocket launch or the allusion to it, and U.S. preparedness to take the fight to North Korea if need be, and then the comments on that aspect of protection and burden sharing and bearing more costs, which struck some as an odd balance, and wonder if you have some thought on that.
I think the electoral dynamics is quite strong in that respect, and it is a talking point that resonates. So that's a part where I think we're going to see more, not less of that, unfortunately. But all the more the necessity to craft this narrative about the alliance and the very unique relationship that the U.S. and South Korea has built. It's a cultivated that South Korea and the United States has built. It's a cultivated relationship. So that putting into context is going to be a very important element that frankly right now is missing. But in terms of the protection terminology, this is also happening in a period where if you look at the global context, U.S. posture in the world, where the contributions, where the priorities are being set and so forth, there is a greater view, and the NATO conference, I think, put a fine point to it, that the U.S. is going to view these type of interactions in a very different way. And so it is front and center looking at how it affects South Korea, but there is a global context to this that from a South Korean perspective, I think that global context is really important. It isn't just narrowly focused on South Korea alone.
And given that shift then in some of the perspectives, European as well as this larger question of a shift away from our traditional understanding of alliances, does that play then to Beijing and to Pyongyang as they look at the situation and, in Beijing's case, perhaps view a vacuum emerging or less reliability on the traditional U.S. alliance structure that may play to their interest? And how does that play to North Korea's desire and their own narrative?
Sure. The interesting thing about looking at the Korean Peninsula is it's something of a canary in the coal mine when these type of events play out. You get to detect, there are indicators, I think, there, if you look for it, in terms of how they're playing out on a larger scale. For South Korea, and it's not unique to South Korea, but you can see it very clearly through the lens of South Korea. This is happening for a while, but the economic future and prosperity has been tied to the Chinese market. And then the security dynamic is very, very closely tied to the United States through the alliance. Managing those two elements, I think, is coming into clearer relief for Southeast Asian countries. But this is playing out in a way that, from a South Korean perspective, it's very difficult to have a strong negotiating position when difficulties in the U.S. relationship are so publicly aired. And so from that element, I wonder in these Beijing-Seoul type of dynamics and negotiations, how much of a solid position the South Korean side could put forward in anything related to the economic or security side of things. There are already rumblings in terms of new security overtures from the Chinese side vis-a-vis South Korea. But the fact that these type of discussions are happening in the open, I think might be one point of evidence, this idea that China is trying to explore how to play a larger role to increase its influence on the Korean Peninsula. This is an opportunity. The saying in international relations, don't let a good crisis go to waste. I think there is that element of calculation by those countries in the region. For North Korea, the dynamic is quite interesting in that we've looked at it in the binary lens of what's happening in the North Korea United States relationship. But there's a third party element, and that's China. Whenever you see these type of summits happen between North Korea and the United States, there tends to be very active overtures from the Chinese side, the sense that they don't want to be left behind. And so while we do see this stalemate in U.S.-North Korea dynamics right now, there's been a lot going on in the China-North Korea relationship. So the binary focus on, again, just the analysis of a series of bilateral relationships, it gets you a piece of the picture, but how it relates to third-party actors and how it raises stakes, might diminish some negotiation positions and so forth. I think we need to map those out to get more of a holistic view of how things are playing out.
Let me press you a bit more on that then. So you see China and North Korea having bonded much closer than hence on the tail of 4 or 5 meetings now between Xi and Kim Jong-un, and suggestions that China, like Russia, are not interested in seeing further movement on sanctions. In fact, just the opposite. How do you see that complex in terms of Pyongyang's approaches to Beijing and Beijing's willingness to exert more and closer relations again after a period where they seem to have moved backward?
Right. One thing that I'd start off with the caveat that this is probably one of the most complex and dysfunctional relationships, the China-North Korea one, and many different layers. The one I would zero in on are the party-party relationships. This is something that is really a long-standing policy of the Chinese side. The Communist Party of China has been actively trying to engage the Workers' Party of Korea, trying to build up the institutions. I think that's a part of a longer-term game plan to build up, to shore up the stability on the Korean Peninsula, particularly between the Communist Party of China and the Workers' Party of Korea. So on the 70th anniversary of the founding of party-to-party relations that just happened last month, you had President Xi, Secretary General Xi, General Secretary Xi of the CPC, basically talking about efforts to work towards building long-term stability on the Korean Peninsula. And I don't think that's new. It's really a reiteration of messages that were sent by his predecessors as well. But the difference now is there's traction. And the traction comes from previous efforts manifesting themselves right now. So October of 2009, when then Premier Won Jae-ba went to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un's father, the 3 agreements that they signed, economic development, tourism, education, those created the legal basis for Chinese entities to engage with the North Korean side. It's significant because that happened in a period where we saw a greater onset of sanctions. So the legal message from the Chinese leadership to the Chinese marketplace that it is okay, it is legal to do business with the North Koreans, those are the gateways that are being widened right now. So we now are tracking the significant increase of Chinese tourism into North Korea. These are not undocumented workers, but more North Korean workers in China, and then also more of these type of economic, commercial deals, really, under the heading economic development. They're significant because under UN Security Council resolution sanctions, each of those clauses mentions that member states of the United Nations are not prohibited from engaging in economic development and humanitarian activities with North Korea. So I think those type of gateways, that's an important element, I think, of tracking how this party-to-party relationship is moving forward on a net-forward basis.
2 weeks ago, former Korea Society President Evans Revere put out a piece in Brookings, via Brookings Institution, saying that he believed that given the improvements in the relationship between China and North Korea, that China, though reluctantly, had bought into the idea of a nuclear North Korea. And his fear is that America, under the current administration, perhaps was moving in the same direction. How do you take that assessment and the register of Chinese acceptance, if not acquiescence, on the nuclear front for North Korea?
I think there's 2 levels to that. There's the official statements, and then in practice, how China deals with North Korea. Drawing on some of the Track 1.5 meetings that I had with colleagues when I was in Washington at the U.S. Institute of Peace, we had an opportunity to engage with Chinese government think tank analysts. And the message was quite clear. China is committed to denuclearization of North Korea and the Korean Peninsula, but in a peaceful manner. This idea that there would be no sudden pressure or almost pushing North Korea into a corner where the ultimatum is you give up your nuclear weapons or else. So the commitment to the principle of denuclearization, I think, is there. But the manner in which China is willing to see that play out is very, very different. If you look at it, the time horizon is quite long. It's almost a gradual shift, but not the regime change type of definition that we've seen in the past, but rather the literal idea that the regime leadership stays in place, the changes in their mindset and their preferences, that they move away from trying to secure a brighter future through nuclear weapons, but through economic development. And so the party-to-party aspect of it, one element that is also playing out is greater focus on having the elements of the North Korean elites, the state trading company, commercial apparatus, what we call North Korea Incorporated, welcomed and now embedded in the Chinese marketplace. And I think that's an element also to try to give these opportunities for the North Korean elites to show that this is a model and a pathway that is there for their taking as well under the right conditions. So there's a learning by doing kind of aspect that has been, I think, a backbone of the party-to-party interactions there. The final point I'd mention on this is that when you look at the time horizon that's laid out, in practice, the shorter end of that, the immediate period, is arms control. There will be no formal statement or recognition of that, but in treatment, in practice, the freezing, the capping, the stabilizing of the program, then working towards eventual denuclearization, those are parts of a foundation of the CPC relationship with the Workers' Party of Korea that in practice is playing out. But of course, that timeline completely is asymmetrical to what the U.S. is thinking about, where during the period of summits between President Trump and Chairman Kim, the talk was about less than 12 months to get the bulk of that denuclearization process done. The element that I think is interesting is sanctions still remain. And it's not that sanctions don't have an impact on the North Korean regime. I think in many respects, it's the notion that this party-to-party relationship introduces a very significant coping mechanism for the regime.
Let me ask you one more question before turning to Tom Byrne and our audience for discussion and questions. And that is that to what degree, and I know you've done some work on this, do you feel North Korea has gotten better at evading sanctions? And then leaning into the new year, secondly, John, what do you see? Are we going to see a rocket test? Do you anticipate a step up in tensions? And if so, what do you think the response of the international community will be?
Sure. Saving the easy questions for last.
There you go.
The first part of it is, this sounds counterintuitive, but North Korea has gotten better at evading sanctions because the sanctions were working. To unpack that, if you look at not only the scale, but the quality of the type of sanctions that were applied to the North Korean regime, old methods of doing business were in the crosshairs. So in many respects, North Korea Incorporated had to get out of those business lines as its primary focus and develop new ways of doing business. In developing new ways, you're looking at types of practices that are very much in line with global levels of expatriate companies doing business in China and Southeast Asia. So that's the part that I think is the innovation. Hiding out in the open, using local partners that are force multipliers for the North Korean regime in these procurement patterns, and using the marketplace. You're not looking at dedicated illicit means of getting it back, but just the sheer volume and masking their transaction, the sheer volume of trade in the region. As it leads to the question of what's going to happen next, let me put an image to people's minds here. It was just unveiled where Chairman Kim and the leadership group, granted they're on these beautiful white horses, and I think there's a lot of focus on what the meaning of the horses are, but it's the context. Where did that take place? It took place in the Mount Paektu area, and it was also the unveiling of this new complex. Samjion can accommodate 4,000 families. And so if you track roughly the top echelon of the North Korean regime, it's about 4,000 families. So the part that I wonder about, and this is speculation, if we see a movement of filling those 4,000 houses. The proximity to China introduces an interesting element that they don't have in practice a viable mutual defense treaty. It's there, but unlikely to be invoked in the way that some would imagine. But here it's not about an alliance function. It's so close, it's right next to the Chinese border, that if you were thinking of targeting this area, that would invoke Chinese defenses. So the indicator that I am tracking is if we see movements there and the alignment of fire statements and the things that we're familiar with leading up to resumption of testing, I worry about what mentality is in place and the decision already made that Samjiyon is kind of a Masada, kind of like a fort, but very much enjoying the protection of China, not because of the alliance, but because any type of effort to target this area would immediately have the reflex of triggering Chinese defenses. So that's the element that would be different. And then the last thing I'd mention here is, there's rumblings in Washington to talk about reinvoking maximum pressure, version 2.0. But the two pillars of maximum pressure are economic coercion, so the sanctions piece, and the second is military pressure. The sanctions piece, for reasons that I laid out, I don't think they're going to be as effective. There are also anecdotal reports that the Chinese authorities have eased up on the implementation of sanctions. They haven't lifted them, but created spaces for the North Korean regime. The other element of economic coercion, though, as well, is you have to get China and South Korea on board for that piece of it. It's unlikely we would see that type of cooperation as we saw with maximum pressure version 1.0. And then quickly on the military side of things, right now we've seen a suspension of the traditional types of US-South Korean military exercises. But what would military deterrent signaling look like for version 2.0? That's an element that I think we're in uncharted territories, because this would happen after the testing that Kim Jong-un carried out in 2017 on the ICBM and the nuclear side. So in terms of capabilities, there's a big debate whether he's there, if he is a nuclear ICBM capable power. But I think the real question is, does he believe it? Not necessarily the capabilities. If he really believes he is, the type of pushing back and the type of posturing and responses that he would have to deterrent signaling would be different from the 2017 period. So those are two elements that I think are very important to monitor going forward. But I think the packaging would be some version of maximum pressure 2.0.
Thank you. Tom?
Thanks, Stephen, for moderating, and thanks, John, for your, I think, insightful and thought-provoking observations. And thanks for joining us again here at the Korea Society. And thank you all for coming, for giving up your lunch. I think it was well worth, or delaying your lunch, whatever, to come here. And we hope to see you again. This is as Stephen said, our final program of 2019. So we hope to see you in January 2020. And happy holidays, and say hey, poke money,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.